My Lords, I'd like to thank the Noble Lord Davis of Brixton for that speech. He didn't pull any punches, which I like, but I didn't like anything else he said. I find myself with Sophie's choice here. This is a bill I intensely dislike, but the opposition arguments against the bill I dislike even more. I'm no fan of the Rwanda plan. For example, the absence of a much-promised review of safe routes means that there's no flexibility about who's permanently deported or any ability to appeal. The bill feels performative, very expensive and unworkable, but mainly I object to a narrow discussion on Rwanda as a substitute for tackling what should be obvious to all by now, that we need a complete overhaul of our current asylum system, a review of often outdated international laws and treaties that are regularly used to limit sovereign lawmaking. And here's my dilemma. Too often, opposition to any or all government proposals on migration, certainly since I've been in this House, mean to sway the immovable blocks, effectively, that tell voters you can't do that. I'm worried when this House plays that role itself of being one of those blocks, and certainly cites treaties and laws internationally made that no one in the UK voted for, that I think feels like a slap against the face of the electorate. I'm glad to hear that across the House there's an understanding that the Noble Lord German's amendment is potentially improper overreach, a sort of cancel culture applied to scrutiny of legislation. But despite this, when the Noble Lord Ponsonby told the House that Labour benches will treat the bill like any other bill, I'm just not convinced that this bill is being treated like any other bill. In fact, all migration legislations and debates I've sat through have felt less like scrutiny or revising in good faith, and more as though they're opposition because of a fundamental disagreement on immigration. But amendments that are being put forward even now, I fear, will gut the original aim of the legislation, and that seems to me to be anti-democratic. There's been a lot of noise ahead of today's debate. In fact, I was reading Politico, and one anonymous Labour peer told that publication that my Lords have been preparing for, quote, trench warfare. He then listed the bill's sins: overturning the Supreme Court, being contrary to international law and human rights and so on. And he said, quote, all these things are likely to put lead in the Lord's pencil. It's interesting that those tools of governance are what excites the juices of my Lords in this House and get them worked up, whereas actually they seem rather indifferent and rarely reference public concerns. In fact, they often are sneered at, those public concerns, as with a dismissal sneer of the will of the people phrase. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, stressed the important issue of individual dignity and the value of each individual, each and every individual. And of course he's right. But that was very much with a focus on those seeking asylum. But can I ask my Lords to broaden their focus? Because I would say that it insults the dignity of the British public when their concerns about the potential security posed by those entering the country illegally in the absence of proper checks are given second-class status versus international treaties. And how to feel vulnerable, I can imagine how vulnerable people feel when they discover that, for example, universities are offering visas to overseas students for lower grades than their kids need to get into on a degree course in this country. There's just a few other issues that are bothering me to finish. Here we are trapped in hours and hours debating the particular safety of one African country, but I feel uncomfortable reading the plethora of briefings sent out by NGOs detailing horror stories from Rwanda, full of human misery, even accusations of torture. But I seriously worry about demonising a country for the purposes of opposing a UK policy and defeating a bill. And maybe I'm being too cynical, but I can't help notice that many of the same NGOs and commentators were cheering on only recently and lionising another African country for taking Israel to The Hague. So why did they then turn a blind eye to South Africa's horrendous record of corruption, massacres for its own workers, a country that has stood by during pogroms of Zimbabwean immigrants and so on? It just seems to me a bit picking and choosing. And then there's the focus on whether the bill will damage our reputation with international institutions. But are such institutions to be treated as sacrosanct? Much play has been made of the UN Commissioners on refugees' condemnation of the bill, and the fact that the UN Commissioner denounced any UK lawmaking that, quote, wants to keep people away from your borders, that will always meet the UN's disapproval, would mean we would never be able to control our borders. But I just object to taking moral instructions from the UN on refugees after the weekend's expose that one of its agencies was implicated in the October the 7th anti-Jewish pogrom. I'll leave it there.
My Lords, I don't like the bill.